Well, thanks for joining me for one of the final videos of the year. I'm going back to that OPFOR series. Now, for the last several videos, we've been talking about hybrid threat, irregular forces, what I generally refer to as IGF, or insurgent guerrilla forces. We discussed, of course, a cultural primer for that before we jumped in deeper. And that's where I'm going back now. I'm going back to Red Team Armies. This is book number 3 of the OPFOR series. It's in its 2nd edition. But this is Red Team Armies. And what we're going to do is a cultural primer, kind of in lump sum, but then try to disaggregate some of that information from, say, North Korean and Chinese and Russian. There are more Red Team Armies, of course. But we're going to just kind of put them all together and then try to separate them out. And to help me do that, I have brought in a guest of mine. This is Long Pang. And Long Pang, among many other things, he is a black hat with the 1 Shepherd Regiment. He also happens to serve as the Regiment S4, so he keeps all of our Miles gear up and running and our weapons up and running, among other things. I'll let him introduce himself a bit, but I will point out that he did not serve in the Chinese Army. He actually served in the U.S. Army Infantry. But that said, Pang was born and raised in mainland China. And so with that said, I will hand off to Pang, and you can give us a little bit of the background of you or your family about, you know, why, you already know why I asked you here, but I'll let you go ahead and articulate that if that's cool.
All right. Thanks for having me. I came to the States 12 years ago. My family had a history with the Chinese military from my grandparents because they were born during the Sino-Japanese War, part of the World War II, in CBI theater. And my uncle, my mom's younger brother, served in the PLA from the 80s to the 90s for about 10 years.
About the same time I did then.
Right, yeah. He, starting as an enlisted man, infantry, and then went to military academy through the, I guess, their own promotion progresses, and ended up doing communication work as a junior officer.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he was also involved in the Tiananmen Square incident as one of the soldiers.
Oh, you had mentioned that before.
Yes.
I had forgotten. Tiananmen Square. Wow. Wow. Okay. Well, that probably merits its own video. We might want to talk about that at some point. Yeah. But first off, thank you for joining me here. And of course, that's why I'm bringing in, because people are right to say, "Hey, look, Doc, you know, you were with the United States Army. What credibility do you have to speak about other militaries that you serve in those other militaries?" And the answer is absolutely not. Now, that doesn't mean that like North Korea, I served against the North Koreans, so I can speak to that.
Yeah.
But that's more anecdotal evidence, if we're going to be honest. And then my books are written through a lot of hermeneutical studies. So I have to study documents that the United States government put out about these various antagonists, but also what other governments and agencies have said about those same, and where you can find, where I very rarely can find an English translation, you know, I read what those armies and militaries say about themselves. And so, but you know, it's right to say, not only what's your point of reference, and you have a very specific point of reference here through your own family and through, you know, growing up in that society and everything. But also, I do want to caution the viewing audience that, look, while I try to stay up on the most current information available to me, the reality is that there's a long delay time. So most of my information, not all, but most of my information's a good 10 years old. So, you know, put it in the early 2010, 2012, 2014, that kind of time frame. And you know, ongoing operations changes things. Political landscape changes things. But I do say, now hold on, America changes, relatively speaking, America changes very quickly. And so you think, what's changed over the last 10 years in our culture? Well, not much. You know, some, but not much. In our force structure, again, some, but not much. In our technology, quite a bit, but our doctrine hasn't caught up. And so earlier this year, I did a piece on Red Team Armies, and specifically a lens looking at the Russian involvement, you know, in the Ukrainian-Russian war, ongoing war. And already I get people saying, well, it's been 8 months later. What's your opinion now? I don't blame people for asking that question, but my opinion is formed on, you know, I think things are moving really fast if we're talking changes within the last 10 years. And they want changes within the last 8 months. And I'm like, no, that's purely speculative. I don't have data sets. I don't have research sitting in front of me. And so I do want to caution people that, look, take this with a grain of salt. I'm trying to give you the most contemporary information that I have, which is why I brought Pang with me. But that said, it does change. Yes. And, of course, as you know, serving in the U.S. Army, it can change from one regiment or one division to the next, too. So, you never step in the same river twice. I would argue that a cultural primer should probably begin with a discussion on, reflections of the nation and the culture that the military defends. And I think the tradition, the 70-year tradition of communism in China it's not quite 70 years there, it's like 50 or 60 years, and Russia had it for a good 70 years, even though it's no longer communist. It hasn't been communist for quite some time, almost 30 years now, or just over 30 years now, but nonetheless it has those traditions, and it has an oligarchy tradition. And then you look at something like North Korea, and it's moved well beyond anything that we would recognize as communism, even though they tout themselves as what was that you were saying earlier? Like the last bastion of communism or something to this effect.
Right. North Koreans regard themselves as the only true communism country that's still out there. They, just like what the Chinese Communist Party did in the late 1960s when Khrushchev took over in the Soviet Union, the Chinese government condemned Khrushchev for being the reformatist and being open to the Western ideology, or at least not against the Western ideology.
Right.
And when Deng Xiaoping did open market and transitioned to a different strategy in China, obviously North Korea felt the same way.
Right. Like they had been betrayed.
Yes.
But then I would argue, culturally speaking, so we're trying to pan out how these are different. Russia becomes more window to the west, which of course it historically used Poland for that anyway, but it had a window to the west through the 60s and 70s under Khrushchev. You see China start doing that as well in the 80s and 90s, and so North Korea denounced it. But what else is important in North Korea at that time was that they had a window of their own, and they could see into South Korea. What people don't recall so well, unless you go back to the newspapers and history books and original documents, was that Korea had been so brutalized by Japan for half a century or more. And they'd been so brutalized by Japan that by the time they'd gotten their independence, and then they went right into a civil war and all of this other stuff. And the popular opinion of the time, go back to the early 1950s in the Western world and all the allies that came to rescue, it was a UN effort to rescue South Korea from the invading North Korea. South Korea was just incredibly impoverished, just an incredibly poor and violent and corrupt place to live. And then by the 1970s, you start seeing the miracle under President/dictator Pak, right? And so you see that Korean miracle that starts to really pan out by the 1980s. And I think what happens is North Korea had this kind of attitude in the 50s and 60s of, we live better. We are communists, we're industrial, we live better than our agrarian, brothers in the South. And look at them, look how poor they are and how struggling they are, because that's true of capitalism, right? There's no one to give them a leg up. Yes. And by the 1980s, and particularly by the Olympics, what was that, the 88 Olympics or 86 Olympics? Yeah. 88. There's a critical moment in time that North Korea sees South Korea skyrocketing economically beyond them. And so there's obviously an internal disinformation campaign and all this other stuff, but the political change of the Kim dynasty, and it is a dynasty by then. It's no longer communism, it's back to its aristocracy. The dynasty needs some legitimacy, and dynasties got legitimacy through, deities. God made me king. Well, this dynasty said, communism needs for me to be a god ruler. And so that's how they established their legitimacy, was the Kim the Kim dynasty of the North Korea really became quasi-God rulers because of communism, not because of any spirituality or God. They're atheists, but because communism, because humanity needs them to be God rulers. And so there is this shift, and it's somewhat subtle, I think, in the 80s, but by the 90s it's fully embraced. And then, the grandson takes, or the son takes over, and then the grandson takes over now. That's who we've had. And so it's not even fair, even though they claim to be the last bastion of communism, it's not even fair to call them communists anymore. Right. They are a religious cult aristocracy. So you really can't compare them in terms of culturally. Mm-hmm. You have a cult-like atheistic worship of a god king versus a tyrannical rule under Xi. You've talked about this on Brett's channel, Brent 0331's channel. If you haven't seen that interview and stuff, do see that. But we shared the whole thing about, well, China does that. It allows liberalism to gain money for a generation, 20 years, and then the next generation ushers in. Well, now that we're flush with cash, let's go back to our totalitarian rule. You tell me if I'm wrong. Here's my impression of that. Forget communism. That's how the Chinese dynasties, that's how they were successful for many, many centuries. Is that incorrect? And no two are the same, I get that. But is that incorrect to say the dynasty always needed money? Now, these aren't religious cult dynasties. These are what I would say legitimate aristocracy, Right. There are dynasties, there are kings and royal courts and everything else. But they needed money. You right. see this in Europe, and they wouldn't have it, and they would tip their hat to all the middle class until they gained money, yep. and then once they had the flush with money, they could be more of a draconian ruler. Is that incorrect for China?
I think it's correct, except in the past, throughout almost 2,000 years of different dynasty, I'd say the shift between the two different type of ruling, dictatorship versus more openly, was not a one generation rotation. It could be up to 3-4 generations, 100 years.
Oh wow.
It could be because in the ancient time it's harder for you to accumulate wealth even as a nation, so that swing doesn't happen that rapidly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, that's true too, because again, let me speak in this is with a big brush, so let me tell you already, I know I'm wrong, but the trend is that first off, China tended to have a much larger territory than, say, a kingdom in Europe. China is controlling a much larger empire, which I guess, for infrastructure's sake is more difficult. Mm-hmm. My impression, and I'm weak on this history, my impression is that China would also, because of that territorial stability, it would very often not collapse into wars, like wars between different territories and stuff. Now, I think wars on the frontiers, with the Muslims in the southwest and maybe the Mongols or the Siberians up north, things like that you saw that on frontiers. Oh, you even saw it in Indochina, right?
Yeah.
So you saw it on the frontiers, but internally, China had, I think, more stability than maybe most eras of Europe. Which had smaller territories and stuff like that, and they fought. And maybe that's why I'm saying why I see that in Europe is, okay, we got a war coming up. So now I need to be nice to everybody, not only to recruit them into my military and, hey, we're us, remember we're all brothers and they're the bad guys, but also to collect those revenues, to get the coffers full. And then you go fight the war. And once you've had success, then you can come back and go, I don't need your money anymore, I don't need your friendship, I can be a draconian ruler again. You see what I'm saying? And there was this, whereas maybe it doesn't flow like that in China. I don't know.
So historically, they actually tried to give more semi-autonomy to farther territory away from the capital in peacetime. And unfortunately, in some cases, it doesn't work out very well. When a local, in this case, let's just say they're a warlord, or the local government get too much power and money, they won't work with the central government anymore.
Okay.
And as they see this multiple times in the 100 years of history, the central government or the empire start to realize, while grabbing the power and reduce the amount of autonomy they have, on a local level might be a more beneficial idea for me to keep control of the country.
Yeah, now that's a balance they have to walk there then, because you're right, on one hand, and I think this does pertain to their military, not doctrine, but their philosophy. And the philosophy really comes to this. It's just like that kind of that wisdom that says you've got to give them enough autonomy to have success.
Right.
And if you come in heavy-handed, you'll destroy that success initially. You want that to take root. You want that to enjoy that success. And then as it starts to develop enough success that they get authority from that success, that's when you have to swing in and say, okay, remember, we're the boss.
Right.
Hit it too fast, you've destroyed the success, and so that's problematic. Go too late, and they start to rival your authority. And you're like, uh-oh, now we have a problem.
Yeah.
Now there's going to be a battle between us, armed conflict or some kind of conflict. So I think I see that. Again, this is taking leaps and bounds, but I'm fairly certain that China has no tradition then of a Magna Carta, an agreement between the king and the nobles, or the king and the subjects. They don't have a rights of man philosophy. They don't have a Declaration of Independence. So, one of the things I noticed working in East Asia, when I was working for an Asian, I worked for the Asian government and worked with military and as well as other institutions. But anyway, the point is, when the Asian boss said no, it meant no. And that finality of no was something that I didn't understand. I saw and heard that, not to be obstinate, not to be disrespectful, but I heard they would always give some polite excuse with no, which I understood as an American of, no, we can't do it that way because there are these challenges we'd have to overcome. That's how an American says no, right? And, there's these challenges we'd have to overcome. That's why we can't do it. And I'm like, so if we overcome this challenge, then I'm doing this wonderful thing for my boss, and he or she will be so happy. And, and what I kept bumping into is they're like, why did you do that? I said no. And, and then sure enough, the Koreans would run in and say, actually, boss, what you said was no because of these challenges. And what this guy did was, this American, he just came in and overcame those challenges. And so we kept bumping into this. And I realized in Asia, there isn't that Magna Carta. You know what I'm saying? It's like, no, the king has spoken. And so I think that's very much the case when we talk about China and North Korea. Again, not so much a king, but a god king, right? So I would say it's even more true for them. You look at their history and their development through that, they really don't have that Magna Carta that empowers other people to do anything other than what the king says. Now, with Russia, it's completely different still. It's oligarchies. They've always had oligarchies. Oligarchies are those middleman money. That's who funded the czars of Russia and stuff like that, right? Was the powerful, rich families that may not have aristocratic titles, may or may not have, but they certainly had funding. Yeah. And if they didn't have an aristocratic title, they could be, well, yes, but they're favored through the church, right? Through the religious institution. And so there were different influences. I mean, is that a fair assessment, you think?
Yeah, it's pretty accurate. The only freedom that the empire or the king's subject will enjoy, in this case in China, will be within the guidelines or the policies that the central government already spoken. Right. Which is unfortunately very unlimited for predominantly the entire time.
Which is why nouveau riche in China today are trying to escape.
Yes.
And I know that's probably not most of them, but so many, a very significant minority of them figure out, look, I've got all this wealth, but it offers me very limited capacities and options and comfort here. Right. Because, frankly, if you start living better than the communist, central figures, there's an image problem there, right? Right. That's the culture. I mean, that's a cultural primer of what we're looking at, how Russia has a lot in common, but is different than China. And China has a lot in common with North Korea, but North Korea has taken this, really bizarre, atheist religious. I know that's the weirdest thing to say, but you know what I mean by that. It's this cult, but it's not based in spirituality. And so it's gone to this extreme. Now, having said that, it's somewhat fair then to say that the militaries of these nations, because they are nations, these aren't insurgent guerrilla forces, it's nothing like that. These are nations very much like America is a sovereign nation. They have a military whose primary mission is to defend the borders, the integrity of the nation, and then also to impose will on an enemy that we determine as an antagonist or a threat. And so they have large militaries, professional militaries, even though they all three use conscripts heavily. They still have a core professional military. And yet, when we look at that, none of them really have an NCO core. And I would argue, as we were discussing earlier, the one that comes closest, ironically, is China, because of their squad structure. Not platoon, not company, but literally, you said, they really don't even have a word for sergeant. The word is squad leader.
Correct.
And so, at that level, China has something akin to an NCO corps, meaning some autonomous decision-making authority for a warrior who is not an officer, a commissioned officer.
Right.
Where North Korea certainly doesn't have that. And indeed, outside of Wagner Corporation, I don't think Russia has that either.